All right. So on Tuesday, we talked about life in the 1950s, or excuse me, America of the 1950s. And if you'll notice, we're still covering the 1950s here. But the reason this is going to be exam 3 material is because our chapter 26 talks about the affluent society. And that's also talking a little bit about what's going on in the 1950s. Okay. So you're going to get like a double dose of the 50s for this weekend, next week. All right. So before we can really understand the 1950s, and there's going to be some overlap between the stuff that's in this lecture for that covers stuff for exam or for chapter 26. There is stuff in here that you're going to be familiar with from chapter 25. Okay. So it's kind of meshed together. All right. So in order to understand life in the 1950s, we have to understand the impact that after World War II, post-World War II era will have on the United States. So the United States in the aftermath of World War II will experience an economic boom. And the reason for that is when we start to see the rebuilding of Europe and the Pacific, but mostly Europe, a lot of those supplies will come from American manufacturers, American businesses, which continues to continue that economic growth in the United States. We will also see that the United States and the Soviet Union will enter into a conflict that we call the Cold War. Okay, and this will affect multiple aspects of the American life. Now, the reason that it's called a Cold War is because we don't see any direct military action between the United States and the Soviet Union. We do see some indirect military actions, but overall, it's not like the United States is invading Soviet Union or the Soviet Union is invading spaces controlled by the United States. Okay. There is stuff in this week's. Yes. Okay. So again, the Cold War is going to have a huge effect on life in the United States. Yeah. Yes. And it's a lot of like warfare through what they would refer to at the time as third world countries. Today we would call lesser developed countries, and kind of stopping the spread of communism globally. And they're trying to expand it globally. Also you asked, and I looked it up. It's called Heir to an Execution, I think is what it's called. Is the name of that documentary about the Rosenbergs and their granddaughter going through and like figuring all this stuff out. It's really wild. And like in that, she like her father and uncle, or like she interviews them and all these people who knew her grandparents and stuff that are still alive at the time. Yeah. All right. So in our Cold War ideologies, we basically have two different economic outlooks warring against one another. So in the United States, we practice capitalism. And in the Soviet Union, we see the practice of communism. Now, the difference is in communism, the state controls everything. Okay, so the state will control their economy. They will control production. So the state will tell you when and how and what to produce. And they also control supply and demand. So they create an artificial supply and demand. In capitalism, which is what we have in the United States, it's based on the idea of a free market. Fun fact, we do not operate on a free market society. If we had a free market society, there would be nothing like tariffs, for example. Okay, free market society, you would never put a tax on something because it's from another country, because generally tariffs are designed to encourage you to engage or buy American products, okay, or domestic products, because capitalism obviously is not just in the United States. So these are our two competing ideologies. Also, you need to know about these two ideologies. In a capitalist country, you're going to see generally the free movement of religion, generally speaking. In a communist country, oftentimes communist countries are going to try to eliminate as much religion as possible. So for example, here's a good example. Anybody here like have a family member that's a minister? Right? Nobody? Okay. So generally speaking, I grew up Southern Baptist. So this is the platform that you're going to hear this from. The church that I grew up in, we had what's called a parish, which is where the minister, the preacher, and his wife and kids would live. In that parish, because it's church property, you do not pay property taxes on that on the house and the land, right? Because you don't tax church property; they get like tax exemption status. Churches in our country don't pay taxes on the land that the church sits on. So if you guys, anybody here from like Tyler, Okay, so Green Acres, which is like 3 city blocks worth of property, they do not pay city or state property taxes on that land. No taxes paid on it. Yeah. Okay. And the reason for this is, and Green Acres is kind of a bad example because they have a lot of people who go there and it's really wealthy. But the church that I grew up going to in Podunk, East Texas, did not have a lot of folks going to it. So as a result, that if you had property taxes, that could potentially shut down your church. So if you know anybody, or if yourself attend a small congregation, it could be pretty detrimental if you're having to pay taxes. In a communist country, generally speaking, there are no tax breaks for things like churches. Okay, so churches are going to have to pay property taxes, and often they would even increase property taxes. So ultimately what you see is that churches are going to go defunct because they can't afford to pay the taxes. Generally speaking, you'll have people who would say, well, we'll just hold church at my house, right? But over time, people will they'll just get out of the practice of going because they're not going to like a communal building where they're used to practicing. If you know anybody, especially during the pandemic, maybe, who are like, well, instead of going to church, I'll watch it online or I'll watch it on TV. And then maybe like 2 years into the pandemic, they're not watching church on Sunday. They're staying out late on Saturdays. And like, you start to see kind of an elimination of that practice. Okay, so we see this in communist countries, that religion in most communist countries. The exception to this rule really is in Poland. In Poland, they were never actually very successful in stamping out the Catholic Church in Poland because Polish people were like, nope, this is what we're going to do. And in fact, I'm going to chase a rabbit here for a second. One of the professors that I had here at UT Tyler, she has since retired. She was first generation American. Her grandparents, her parents moved here from Poland. And during the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, she worked for the Department of Defense and taught in American high schools in Europe on military bases. And on the weekend, she would go and like travel around Europe. And she went and visited some of her family members in Poland, which when you would travel into the Soviet Union, you'd have to have like special permission and passports, but she would go visit her family. And so she was also very Catholic. And one day they were at this celebration. She was telling us in class one day, and it was like a Catholic holiday in Poland. And she heard these guys speaking in Polish behind her that they were going to go lead a resistance against the Soviet Union. And the boy's mom said, no, don't do it. I don't want you to get in trouble. And he was like, oh, they would never retaliate on a Catholic holiday towards us because of how Catholic Poland was. So I'm just kind of showing you here. And then a lot of communist countries, they're going to eliminate a lot of that religion, right? But it did not work in Poland. And the reason, oh yes, go ahead.
Question, sorry, it's off topic, but wasn't like the third world and first world country distinction based off like communism and capitalism?
No, so your third world, first, second, third world countries, which today we don't actually use those terminologies, but you hear it a lot in the Cold War era when we're referencing these things, are based on their economic development. That's what that is. So you're going to see a lot of American and Soviet influence in these third world countries. Today, we would refer to them as lesser developed countries, trying to prop up capitalist or communist groups. So the United States is going to try to prop up capitalist groups, even if they're dictatorships in places like Latin America, to prevent the spread of communism. So yes, you will see that kind of stuff going on there. The other thing I wanted to tell you about religion, the reason that they want to get rid of religion is a very practical approach, because in a communist country, they want you to be 100% dependent on the state for everything. Okay. So in the United States, and I'm just going to guess because we're in the South, that some of you guys are pretty religious or religious people, right? If somebody asked you to choose between the United States and your religion, most people I know who are religious people are going to choose their religion 100% of the time, right? They do not want that in a communist state. They want you to rely on the state and be devoted to the state 100%. And it's going to be a slow trickle down of getting rid of your attachments to religion. It's not like they just come in one day and are like, oh, we're getting rid of religion, because usually folks will get fired up about that. But they'll start to increase taxes, property taxes. You can't afford the buildings. People say, oh, I'll go to church at someone's house. And then eventually that kind of just dies off, except for in Poland. They're hardcore about it. Like, you are not going to mess with the Polish. As a result, my professor was super proud of being Polish. So anytime we got a chance in history class, she'd be like, and Poland did this. You're like, okay. Okay. Now, there are some things that arose between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is pre, during, and after the Second World War. One, the Red Scare, which is what we talked about pretty heavily on Tuesday. The United States sees the Red Scare as an opportunity for the Soviet Union and communist ideology to creep into the everyday lives of Americans. The second one is the Comintern movement, which we've talked about before. Remember, Comintern, the first part of that stands for Communist International. Okay, so Comintern movement basically is just spreading communism internationally. The United States is obviously very much against that, to the point in which we will develop things like a containment policy, which I believe is discussed in this week's chapter, and this idea of domino theory. If one country, especially in Asia, falls to communism, then eventually they're all going to like trickle down. The United States is still pretty peeved at the Nazi-Soviet pact, which was signed between Hitler and Stalin at the beginning of World War II. Remember, we talked about that, and the division between the two countries over Poland. There we go again, with Poland specifically. Also, we see that the United States is upset, or excuse me, the Soviet Union is upset with a delayed Western Front fighting by the US. So when we get involved in World War II, and this is last week when I was sick, so we didn't talk about it directly in class, but when we get involved in World War II, so we have Pearl Harbor, and the United States and Japan declare war on each other. Just after Pearl Harbor, you're going to see that Germany will declare war on the United States. And Italy. So when we go to Europe to fight the front in Europe, we do not start fighting. Most of you guys probably have this image of like the D-Day invasion where we go and land on the beaches of Normandy and like liberate Europe. That was not our first initial progress in the Western Front fighting. We actually started fighting in Northern Africa, and we went from Northern Africa and then hopped into Italy. And then as we were liberating Italy, then later in June, we will come through and invade through Normandy. So the Soviets, the reason they're upset about this, and I believe this might have also been covered in your textbook last week, the Soviets will lose 20 million people in the Second World War, like way more people than anybody else. And part of that reason is, as Hitler is trying to take over the Soviet Union, so he's like invading the Soviet Union, or the Eastern Front of the Soviet Union, or Russia. As he's invading there, the Soviet Union is trying to just like hold them off, but civilians are just dying en masse. So when the United States engages in the war, the Soviet Union wants us immediately to come and engage the Germans on the Eastern Front of the Soviet Union. We do not do that. Instead, we go to Northern Africa. So that's going to cause a problem in the post-World War II era between the two countries. Partly because we did this and upset them when the United States, when we finish the war in Europe. So war in Europe will end, and then there'll be a couple of more months before we end the war in the Pacific. Okay, so after the war in Europe is over, we are fighting the Japanese, and we're doing what's called an island hopping campaign, where we're fighting the Japanese on these various islands, like Iwo Jima, for example, and Okinawa. Well, as the United States is fighting, the Soviets are not fighting the Japanese at all. And at this point, FDR has died, and FDR's approach to the Soviet Union and Stalin is a little soft, especially for somebody like Harry Truman. Harry Truman does not trust Joseph Stalin any bit at all, not even like a little tiny bit. So Truman says to Stalin, if you guys do not engage with the Japanese, you will not be at the table when we do the peace agreement at the end of the war. So literally a few days before we dropped the first bomb on Japan, the first atomic bomb on Japan, the Soviets will do a small skirmish with the Japanese just off the Japanese island. So it's very minimal fighting, and this upsets the United States. And then finally, the Soviet refusal for a Western voice in Eastern Europe. Okay, so what we're talking about here is all of these countries in the Western portion of Europe, they're going to hold elections. Do we want to be a capitalist type country or like a democracy, or do we want to go Soviet or like communist? In Europe, in the Western portion, all of these countries overwhelmingly choose democracy. Allegedly, in the Eastern portion, they all choose communism, like at 100% election rate. So anytime you hear anybody say that there's 100% election rate in anything, that's a big red flag that was not a fair election, right? I think I used this idea with you guys earlier. No, this was my other class. Okay, my History 1 class when we're talking about unanimous approval in like Senate and stuff like this. If I were to say to you, this is not going to happen because I'm poor, that I'm bringing us all lunch one day, right? We can all agree pizza's the best lunch, right? No, some people like, no, I want tacos or I want burgers or I want a salad because I'm a vegetarian. You see, like if we can't agree on something as minor as like what is the best lunch, what is the likelihood that an entire country is going to agree on the best form of government? Very, very tiny. All right. So that's going to create further that divide between the United States and the Soviet Union. Sometimes when we're talking about the Cold War, you'll hear it referred to as the West. And so when we talk about the West, we're talking about the United States and Western Europe, but really the United States is running this game, right? This is between the United States and the Soviet Union. So speaking of FDR, before he passes away, FDR will meet with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. Often when we speak about these three men together, we refer to them as the big three, okay? And if you can look in the middle of this picture, sitting down, that is FDR. And you can tell, especially if you guys can remember pictures of him when we were doing the Great Depression, he's clearly not as well as he once was. He is aged significantly. He doesn't look very healthy. And he will have a brain aneurysm within a few months of this picture. At the Yalta Conference, they decide to divide Germany into zones of occupation. And one of the things that Stalin specifically is pushing for is called reparations. And basically what reparations is, or what reparations are, is after a war, whoever was determined to have started the war and caused all the problems, basically the person who lost, they have to pay back the debts of the countries who won. Okay, we did this after World War I. And because of that, we see this economic downturn in Europe, which created a downturn in the United States back and forth that we talked about, that ping-ponged into the Great Depression. Britain and America, so Churchill and FDR, they do not want reparations. They are strongly against reparations. And in fact, at this point, Stalin is talking about like he wants $20 to $25 billion from Germany specifically. So they were able to table this, which means we're going to talk about it later. Ultimately, at the end game, there are no reparations from World War II, predominantly because the West, the United States and Britain here, were afraid that if you did put these massive reparations on Germany, that it would create another economic problem and enable somebody like another Hitler to come up in power and blame everything on somebody else and say it's not our fault. Okay. Our next major conference is going to be the Potsdam Conference, which takes place in Germany. And here you can see that the British have elected a new foreign minister, or a new prime minister rather, which I cannot remember his name, so apologize. The guy in the middle is Harry Truman. And then the guy on the right is still Joseph Stalin. I told you guys about 2 seconds ago, Harry Truman does not trust Joseph Stalin at all. So he is going to be a much more hardline negotiator with Stalin than FDR ever was, which is probably the reason we do not see reparations on Germany. But at this conference, they agreed to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Those prosecutions take place in what's called the Nuremberg trials. And this also happens to be Truman's first official meeting with Joseph Stalin. So the Potsdam Conference, this is where they agree to prosecute Nazi war crime victims, or criminals rather, war criminals. As a result of this, you will actually see some folks escape away from Nazi Germany and actually move to either South America or even parts of the United States to evade prosecution. Like they'll just like create a whole new identity, which back then was way easier to create a whole new identity than it is today. Yeah, from the United States, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, recently, like within like the last year, right? Yeah. So back at home, we see this economic boom. And there are a couple of ways to measure an economic boom. This is also ways that we measure an economic boom even today in this country. So sometimes you see it's by how well cars are selling, right? How well houses are selling, things like that. Also, if you guys recall, construction, that's another way to measure the boom. So in the post-World War II era, so in the 1950s, we see that the number of cars produced and sold annually will quadruple. The housing market's going to soar due to low rate mortgages, especially low rate mortgages for veterans. And then also we will see that the federal government will engage in heavy defense spending to protect the United States from the Cold War, which will also stimulate the market. And in some ways, I don't think I have it in this lecture, but in some ways, the defense spending is like funding higher education. That's one of the things that they spend a lot of money on, specifically in what in academia we refer to the hard sciences. So like biology, chemistry, engineering, things like that, and the creation of ultimately what becomes NASA. So you will see incentivized programs to get people to enter colleges to get degrees in those hard sciences. And sometimes even would get them for free if they would go to college. The federal government would pick up the tab so that they can compete with the Soviet Union. All right. So let's talk about this gross domestic product. This kind of just shows you, you don't have to write this down. Okay, I'm just giving you guys an idea of what it looks like here. So you can see in the year of 1940, our gross domestic product is 1.3 trillion, but by 1950, you're at 2.29 trillion. 1955, it keeps raising. Look, my 1960, which is what we're going to start when we come back from our from next week. Or we won't be here next week, but we'll start the week after. The 60s, it's 3.2 trillion. And then you can see here in 2017, it was 18 trillion in our gross domestic product. So we see this giant rate. And you can see the rate of increase over here in the 50s that indicates that your economy is rapidly growing. So as the economy is growing in the United States, we recognize in our federal government that the European economy is faltering. And one of the reasons for that is when your country or when your entire continent has been devastated by a war, it's very difficult to just start picking up the pieces and going back acting like everything is normal. And the federal government and the Truman administration specifically recognized that in order to keep the American economy going, we have to be able to sell stuff to the rest of the world. So the Secretary of State under Harry Truman is George C. Marshall, who is also a general, as you can see here. He fought in he didn't fight technically. He was the creator of all of American war plans during World War II. So he oversaw both the European theater and the Pacific theater. Marshall comes up with this idea, an economic plan called the Marshall Plan. And it's designed to rebuild Europe in the post-World War era. During the time that the Marshall Plan is being introduced, the United States will spend over $12 billion from 1948 to 1952. So the way the Marshall Plan worked is if you were so any country in Europe technically could apply for funds from the Marshall Plan. So they set up an economic advisory panel essentially, and countries in Europe would develop a plan of action. This is how much money we need. This is how we're going to spend this money. And this is how it's going to benefit us on the long run. Then they would develop, once they had developed that plan of action, they would take it to the Economic Committee that was established through the Marshall Plan. The committee would review the plan and then either approve it at full rate or they would like reduce the rate of money given or whatever. And then that country would have that money and could go forth and spend it. There are catches in the Marshall Plan. One of those catches is when you buy goods, like the equipment that you're going to use and the supplies and all that fun stuff, you have to buy it from American manufacturers. This is how we keep the economy going. Anybody here from the Longview area? Have you guys heard of Laterno? You've heard of Laterno, so you're from Longview, right? Not just the college, but the company Laterno, right? Laterno used to make giant heavy equipment like bulldozers and things like that, and they sent them over to Europe after the in the post-World War II era. My grandfather worked there, right? So it was a major business in Longview, Texas, and it's not just Longview, all over the country. These giant businesses are going to be built up by rebuilding Europe. Oh, so also back to the Marshall Plan. The other thing is, since any country in Europe could apply, the Soviet Union refused to allow any of the countries within their sphere of influence to apply, predominantly because they do not want America or the West to have any say on how that money is being spent in the Soviet Union countries, right? So if you need an example of this, if you've ever borrowed money from your parents to pay rent or make a car payment or whatever, and then you went and bought something super expensive that was not necessary, your parents are probably going to be like, what the hell? Why are you buying this super expensive, not necessary item when you had to borrow money from me to pay rent, right? So there's a little oversight. All money that you get from somebody, unless you earned it yourself, comes with strings attached. Know this, okay? We have a life lesson here. So if you borrow money from mom and dad or anybody else, and then they think that you're spending other things unwisely, they're going to tell you, and they're going to want their money back, okay? So that's the same thing. Stalin does not want to have any Eastern European countries being monitored or controlled by Western influence. Okay. Harry Truman will introduce what's known as the Fair Deal. So this is President Harry Truman. This is his domestic program. So under FDR, we had the New Deal, and Truman gives us the Fair Deal. In this program, Truman believed specifically that the federal government should guarantee economic opportunities and social stability for all Americans. Within this plan, he's going to present a 21-point plan. Presidents love to make plans, right? Like under Woodrow Wilson, we have the 14-point plan. Like, people love plans. Harry Truman presents a 21-point plan to Congress that will include things like protections against unfair employment practices and a higher minimum wage. But this is something as American voters that we should always remember. You have presidents who come in and promise things, but the people who make the laws are in your legislature, right? So if you're really passionate about a topic, you should know how the person you're going to vote for as president feels about that issue, right? Like, if your issue is higher minimum wage, you probably don't want to vote for somebody who's like, we should have no minimum wage. People should just be paid pennies if they want to, right? Do not vote for that person. All right. But if you're really passionate about a higher minimum wage and you elect somebody like Harry Truman who says, I'm for higher minimum wage, and then it doesn't happen, and then you get pissed off at Harry Truman, well, Harry Truman does not write the laws. He can only encourage Congress to do so much. What I'm telling you is, when you're passionate about something, gripe at your Congress people, your representatives, and your senators. Those are the people who might make the laws. Okay. So Truman's 21-point plan will include some of these practices. By the way, Harry Truman will, it may have it on here. Harry Truman desegregates the U.S. military, right? So he's going to integrate the military, no more desegregation. This is going to make Harry Truman, who is a Democrat, very unpopular with Southern Democrats. Not really excited about Harry Truman, because remember, part of being in the Southern caucus of the Democrats is supporting things like segregation. Remember, that's why FDR was hesitant to try to push New Deal programs that would benefit African Americans in the South, because he was afraid of losing the votes of Southern Democrats. All right, but one of the most influential bills that comes from the post-World War II era that we still use today is known as the GI Bill. This is a hugely important issue for containing or maintaining that economic boom. If you guys will recall, after World War I, Congress agreed to create a pension for veterans who fought in World War I, but they didn't get it until 1945. And then we have a Great Depression, and they go march on Capitol Hill. They want their pensions. Congress says no. And then you have the bonus army being pushed out of the city of Washington, D.C., and creates a big kerfuffle, right? After World War II, instead of making veterans wait, we're going to enable and assist veterans now. Okay, so this is immediate assistance. It's going to be signed into law in 1944 by President Roosevelt before he passes away in 1945, and is a key pillar in Truman's Fair Deal. Now, benefits to the GI Bill payments include tuition and living expenses if you're going to college, low-cost mortgages that you can get, low interest rates for business loans if you want to open your own business, and if you chose, you could also apply for a one-year unemployment compensation where they'd pay you for a year. By 1956, almost 8 million veterans had been using the educational benefits associated with the GI Bill. Now, unfortunately, the GI Bill benefits are issued at the local level. Generally, before there was a creation of a VA, which is where most veterans now go to get their benefits, at this time, they were using like the VFW, stuff like that, Veterans of Foreign Wars, to come in and like help administer some of these processes. Also, the American Foreign Legion sometimes too, at like little units in local areas, little congregants in local areas to benefit. So if you're, my brain has stopped. If you were a veteran, you would go to this local area and you would apply for benefits. Now, the reason I'm telling you why this is unfortunate, if you're a veteran and you're like, I don't know, African-American, and you live in the South, if you went to your local area, they could just say, no, you don't qualify for benefits. So also women who fought in World War II and auxiliary units in World War II also were able to get these benefits, but they were also frequently denied benefits because the people who are administering on the local level, they don't have any oversight, like the federal government's not providing any oversight, and they can do whatever the hell they want, okay? As a result, should go without saying, the people who benefit from GI benefits in the 1950s predominantly or overwhelmingly are white Americans. Since veterans can apply for things like low rate mortgages, you start to see these, what we now refer to as suburbs, start being developed outside of cities with these houses that have, that can be quickly built and sold very quickly as well. They're known as Levitt towns initially. They're named after the designer of the towns, which his name is William Levitt. So he starts building these suburban places, or these suburban communities at the end of World War II. One of the most predominant and most famous of them, he builds on Long Island in New York. And one of the reasons that this is so influential and so beneficial is that both the Veterans Administration, the VA, and the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, would guarantee the loans that veterans were applying to. So what that means is if the veteran were to go like bankrupt or whatever, the VA and the FHA would pay off that mortgage to the bank. Okay, so they're guaranteeing that. Also, it's important to know here that buying a home at this time, being able to get these low rate mortgages, and often veterans can apply at this time, could apply for a mortgage without having a month, like a down payment. And if I'm not mistaken, veterans can still, because this is a benefit of the VA today, if you're in the military or you former military, that you can get FHA loans for through the VA. And I don't think you have to have a down payment today to buy a house. Is that correct? Yeah. So whereas like, so I'm not a veteran. If I was going to go buy a house, most people would require me to have like at least a 5% or 10% of the total cost of the house as a down payment, right? But veterans, they don't have to meet that market. So this is very beneficial for the building of these homes, but also it allows veterans to get into these houses quickly. Now, the Levitt and Son construction company, which makes the Levitt towns, will use assembly line techniques to build these houses. Most houses could be built within a day. There were 27 steps. So they would mass produce and mass organize like all of the different parts of the house that they would need. And what they're doing is they have 1 or 2 house plans that are made, and then that's what they're using to build all of the houses in the same community. So for example, my girlfriend built a house last year, right? So when she built her house, when she met with her builder, she had an idea of what she wanted the house to look like. They kind of drew up some sketches. The builder went to an architect. He drew the house plans, like the blueprints of the house. And then, which she had to pay for, is like, $800 to pay for those blueprints. And then when she had the blueprints, then that's what the builder used to give to like well, he was, I guess, yeah, he's the builder, but he like hires people who come out and frame the house. So they have the blueprints there and they're supposed to build the house like that, right? Here, instead of having blueprints for each individual house, they just reuse the same blueprints over and over again, which cuts down on your cost. And you can start like, well, I need so many 2x4s cut this long. We'll just go cut them in mass and bring them in, which also lowers the cost of your supplies. All right. Levittown homes included modern appliances. Also, that a lot of them came with white picket fences and green lawns. So they're selling that American dream. The first set of homes for Levittowns began in March of 1947, and they sold 1,400 homes within 3 hours. It goes quick. And I think I might have had it on the last slide. It was actually cheaper for veterans because they could get a loan without a down payment. Oh, sidebar, I just remembered, during this time period, if you were not a veteran and you were going to buy a home, you had to put 50% down payment of the house. That's how much it cost for a down payment. So even if your house is like 10 grand, $5,000 in like 1950, that's a lot of money. And was actually cheaper for veterans to get a mortgage than it was for them to pay rent in cities. So like, for example, Long Island, New York, which is where one of these Levittowns is built, one of the first, which is a very expensive place to live in New York City today. New York City in itself, very expensive to live, but they could pay like 1/3 of the rate of a rent for mortgage out on Long Island, right? And so that's how you start seeing all these veterans moving into these communities. So here's an example of the Levittown here as they're building it up. And then this is basically the tract communities that they're creating. Now, if you go to, especially in more urban areas, not necessarily in Tyler, but if you are ever in the New York City area, and if you go into like Long Island and the very old communities, you'll see a lot of the houses all look the same. Like it's very like cookie cutter looking. But today people want much more like different kinds of styles, and like craftsmen and all these other words you hear on HGTV that I don't really know what means. Right? That's what you get. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about today, so don't run away from me just yet, is the election of 1952, which is kind of backwards because we did election 1954 on Tuesday. So I apologize for the backwardsness here. I did tell you guys on Tuesday, so I'll re-emphasize this to you today, that Eisenhower, when he decided to run for office, Eisenhower was courted by both the Democrats and the Republicans. Because, and especially during this time period, if you were in the military, you tried to avoid politics altogether, right? And even today, when you have, so for example, in our modern politics, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the White House, right? His name is Mark Milley, General Mark Milley. He's in the military, right? He serves under President Biden. He also served under President Trump. So a lot of times when you have people like that, the idea is you want somebody who's like politically neutral. Like when you're in the military, you serve for like the ideology of the military. You're not trying to like gain the political system as well. That's what I'm trying to say. So Eisenhower, when he was in the military, he had no political affiliation. And when he comes out of the military, he will ultimately decide that he's a Republican. He will face off with Adlai Stevenson, the same guy he faced off with in 1954. And it's basically the same story of 1954 here. Eisenhower has a great slogan, "We like Ike," remember? And beer theory, nobody wants to hang out with, nerdy old Dwight or Adlai Stevenson. Everybody wants to hang out with the war hero, Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, so overwhelmingly, you're going to see Eisenhower win the election. Here is our electoral map. Again, very similar to 1954. You see the Solid South Democracy. This is where it starts to break down in the 1950s. We'll see a little bit of a revival of it in the 1960s with President Kennedy and then President Johnson, who is from Texas, so that kind of benefits him. But by the time we get to 68 with Nixon, the Solid South really isn't a thing anymore. And part of that reason, again, is that Truman, the Democrat, will desegregate the military, which upsets a lot of these more conservative segregationists in the American South. And the other thing that Truman did, which Truman often doesn't get really credited for any kind of civil rights movement stuff, Harry Truman was the first president to speak at a NAACP national convention as a sitting president, which is a big deal that he went and spoke, because no president before him, which the NAACP was created in like the late 19th, early 20th century. So within 4 decades, he was the first one to do it. All right. So we are starting to see the diminishing of that Solid South democracy. Are there any questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
So, Harry Truman consolidating the military, is that, do you think that could be like the turning point for when, you know, party flip?
It's starting to be. The real party flip is going to happen with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under Johnson, which we will talk about. There was something else I wanted to say. So yes, Harry Truman is starting to break down some of those racial barriers. You're starting to see that Democrats are starting to value democracy or equality among the races. That is not as common in the South. Harry Truman is from Missouri, so he's not really a Southerner, or how they would consider to be a Southerner at the time. You laugh, yeah, but he's not really considered to be a Southerner. But yes, we're going to start to see that, but the real flip comes under the Johnson administration. And we will actually see in 1968 with Nixon deploys what he calls the Southern strategy, which is a specific strategy by Republicans to gain influence in the American South. So all of that's coming up. All right. Any other questions?